I gave my life to a toxic family business, built it back from ruin, then walked away when they handed everything to the golden child who never worked a single day. Hey Reddit, I'm a 34-year-old male and I finally learned to set boundaries. But growing up, that word didn't exist in my family. Let me paint you a picture. My grandfather started this chain of barbecue restaurants back in the 1960s. It was his baby, and he poured everything into it: blood, sweat, tears, you name it. When he passed, my dad and Uncle Mike inherited it. Sounds nice, right? Wrong. The problem was neither of them had a clue how to actually run a business. Grandpa's passion held it together while he was alive, but after that, it was all downhill. They ran it like it was their personal playground, and guess who was expected to clean up their messes? Yep, me. I got roped in when I was 10 years old. It started small, cleaning tables after hours or doing inventory. It's just a little help, they said. But by the time I was 12, I was spending entire weekends in the back of the kitchen, chopping vegetables and mopping floors. And not once did I get so much as a dime for my trouble. Family doesn't charge family, Dad would say whenever I asked about payment. But this so-called rule only applied to me. My cousin Ryan, Uncle Mike's son, never had to lift a finger. He was either too young or too busy. Meanwhile, I was practically a full-time employee without a paycheck. I remember one summer when I was around 14. The restaurant was short-staffed because one of the cooks quit mid-shift. My dad called me out of bed at 6 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday to help out. I spent the entire day in the back, sweating over a stove and running food to tables. By the end of the day, I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. When I asked if I could take Sunday off to recover, Dad just laughed. Recover from what? It's called hard work, he said. Meanwhile, Ryan was off at some water park with his friends, posting pictures of funnel cakes and water slides. It was infuriating. The unfairness wasn't just limited to work either. Every family gathering turned into a bragfest about Ryan. Uncle Mike would go on and on about how Ryan was going to take the business to the next level one day. They even joked about him becoming CEO. CEO of what? The guy hadn't even stepped foot in a kitchen, let alone managed a shift. And it wasn't like I was a slacker. By the time I was 16, I was basically running the weekend shifts on my own. I handled scheduling, inventory, and even customer complaints. One time, a customer's order got completely botched. Wrong meat, wrong sides, the works. I fixed it, comped their meal, and got them a gift card to make up for it. The customer ended up leaving a glowing review. My dad's response? Good job, but next time, try not to mess up in the first place. I can't even count the number of times I was called in to fix problems that weren't my fault, like the time one of the dishwashers decided to quit in the middle of the lunch rush. Instead of calling another adult or, doing it themselves, Dad called me out of school to cover for him. I spent 4 hours scraping burnt barbecue sauce off pans, while my friends were out enjoying their lunch break. Then there were the family meetings. These were basically just excuses for my dad and Uncle Mike to dump their responsibilities onto everyone else. They'd sit us down in the dining area after hours and talk about how we all need to pitch in. Translation: I needed to work even harder to make up for their bad decisions. One time, Uncle Mike decided to add a salad bar to one of the locations without telling anyone. He didn't do any research or planning. He just showed up one day with a truck full of lettuce and croutons. Guess who had to figure out how to make it work? Me. I spent an entire week setting it up, training the staff, and making sure it didn't completely tank. When the salad bar failed, because no one goes to a barbecue joint for salads, Uncle Mike blamed me for not marketing it well enough. By the time I was 17, I started to realize that this wasn't normal. My friends had part-time jobs where they actually got paid, and their families didn't expect them to sacrifice their entire lives for tradition. But every time I brought it up, I was met with the same line: you should be proud to be part of something bigger than yourself. Proud of what? Working for free while Ryan got treated like a prince? No thanks. It all came to a head when I turned 18. I was finishing up a shift when Ryan strolled in with his dad. He was dressed in some fancy new clothes, talking about how he'd just gotten back from a treat trip with his friends. A treat trip? The guy hadn't even worked a day in his life. Uncle Mike looked at me and said, "You should be taking notes from Ryan. He's got the right mindset for leadership." I couldn't believe it. I'd been breaking my back for years, and they wanted me to take notes from someone who didn't even know how to sweep a floor. That was the moment I knew I had to get out. But it wasn't going to be easy. My family had spent my entire life tying my self-worth to the business, and breaking free felt impossible. Still, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep sacrificing my happiness for their entitlement. And that's just the start of the story. Trust me, it gets worse before it gets better. I realized I couldn't keep living like that, constantly working for free in a business that treated me like cheap labor. while Ryan lived his best life without lifting a finger. I'd had enough. I told my parents I wanted to go to college, and not just any major. I wanted to study marketing. I'd always been drawn to the creative side of business, and I figured if I was going to put my time and energy into something, it might as well be something I enjoyed. When I brought it up to Dad, his face twisted like I just told him I was planning to rob a bank. "Why would you waste time and money on college?" he asked. "You've already got a career lined up here. You should be grateful we've built this for you." "Grateful for what?" I shot back. "I've been working here for years without pay." "That's what family does," he said. "Like it was supposed to make everything okay. Ryan will join us eventually, and you two will run it together. That's how we keep the legacy alive." "Ryan?" It always came back to Ryan. This guy, who still didn't know how to do a single thing at the restaurant, was apparently my future business partner. I knew I couldn't let that happen. Uncle Mike, of course, had to stick his nose in. "The business doesn't have extra funds for college," he said, as if I'd asked him to sell his car to pay for my tuition. "If you want to go, you'll have to figure it out yourself. We can't be funding personal ambitions." The hypocrisy of that statement made me want to scream. Uncle Mike had just bought Ryan a brand new laptop for his future studies in hotel management, fully funded by the business. Meanwhile, I was being told to fend for myself. But if there's one thing those years at the restaurant taught me, it's how to hustle. I applied for every scholarship I could find, took on 2 part-time jobs, and even worked as a delivery driver on weekends. I didn't care how hard it was. I just needed to get out of there. The first few months of college felt like freedom. I wasn't tied to the restaurant anymore, and for the first time in years, I had the chance to figure out what I actually wanted. I loved my marketing classes, especially the ones that focused on branding and customer behavior. I'd spend hours working on projects and brainstorming ideas, and it felt good to use my brain for something other than calculating food costs or dealing with angry customers. Of course, my family didn't make it easy. Dad called constantly, asking when I'd come home to help. "The weekends are tough without you," he'd say, like I was supposed to drop everything and drive back just because they didn't want to hire more staff. One time, Mom called me in tears. "Your dad's so stressed," she said. "Can't you just come home for one weekend and help out?" "No, Mom," I said firmly. "I've got 2 jobs and a full course load. I can't just drop everything." "Well, Ryan's been helping out a lot lately," she said, clearly trying to guilt me. I almost laughed out loud. Ryan helping? Sure, maybe he showed up once in a blue moon to supervise a shift, but I knew he wasn't doing anything that actually mattered. I'd heard from my friends, who still worked there, that Ryan spent most of his time chatting with customers and avoiding the kitchen entirely. By the time I hit my second year of college, I'd gotten into a good rhythm. My scholarships covered most of my tuition, and my jobs paid for the rest. It wasn't easy. I'd pull all-nighters working on marketing projects, only to wake up at the crack of dawn for my delivery shift, but I felt like I was finally doing something that mattered. Meanwhile, the family drama continued. Every time I came home for a holiday or break, the guilt trips would start all over again. Dad would corner me and say, "I don't understand why you're wasting time learning about marketing when we could teach you everything you need to know right here." Uncle Mike would chime in with, "This business is your future, whether you like it or not. You're going to come back eventually, so why not start now?" I learned to tune them out, but it wasn't always easy. They had a way of making me feel like I was abandoning them, even though I knew, deep down, they were the ones who'd let me down. One summer, I decided to take an internship with a local marketing agency instead of working at the restaurant. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd finally leave me alone. Instead, it made things worse. "You're working for strangers?" Dad asked when I told him. "How can you be so disloyal to your family?" "It's an internship," I explained. "It's not like I'm moving away forever." "It's the principle of the thing," Uncle Mike said. "You're turning your back on the people who've always been there for you." "Always been there for me?" The audacity was almost laughable. But the internship turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made. I learned more about branding, digital campaigns, and customer engagement in 3 months than I ever had at the restaurant. By the time I finished, I felt more confident in my abilities than ever. Of course, my family didn't see it that way. When I came home for Thanksgiving that year, Dad gave me the cold shoulder for most of the night. Uncle Mike made a snide comment about how real loyalty doesn't come with a paycheck, and Ryan couldn't resist bragging about how he'd helped run the place all summer. I didn't bother arguing. I knew they'd never see things from my perspective, and honestly, I didn't care anymore. I was building a future for myself, one that didn't involve being chained to their outdated, dysfunctional business. Once I finished college and started my career in marketing, I thought I was finally free of the family business. It turns out, No matter how far you think you've gotten, guilt has a way of sneaking back in, especially when it comes to family. By the time I turned 23, I'd landed my first real job at a small marketing agency. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was nothing to brag about, but I loved it. I got to work with a mix of small businesses and startups, helping them build their brands from scratch. It felt good to be valued for my ideas, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was just some cog in a dysfunctional machine. Of course, my family didn't see it that way. To them, it didn't matter that I was doing well for myself. What mattered was that I wasn't doing it for them. "You're wasting your talent," Dad said during one of my rare visits home. "All those skills you learned could be helping the family." "It's not a waste," I told him. "I'm happy with what I'm doing." "That's not the point," he said, as if my happiness didn't factor into the equation. "You're turning your back on everything your grandfather built." That was his go-to line, by the way. Anytime he wanted to guilt me into doing something, he'd bring up Grandpa. "Your grandfather worked so hard to build this business," he'd say. "Do you really want to let all his sacrifices go to waste?" It was like he had a script, and he never missed a line. It wasn't just my parents either. Uncle Mike had his own version of the guilt routine. Whenever I visited, he'd corner me in the dining area after hours and give me one of his infamous lectures. "This business is your legacy," he'd say, pacing back and forth like he was delivering a TED Talk. "Ryan can't do it all on his own. He needs you." That one always made me laugh on the inside. Ryan, the guy who spent more time on social media than actually working, the idea that he was carrying anything was a joke. But I kept my mouth shut because I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The worst part of all of this wasn't the guilt trips themselves. It was how relentless they were. Every time I came home, there was a new angle, a new way to frame their disappointment in me. One time, Uncle Mike even brought out the big guns, public shaming. We were at a family barbecue, one of those rare moments where everyone pretended to get along, and he decided it was the perfect time to air his grievances. "You know," he said loudly, catching the attention of everyone within earshot, "it's a shame you're not part of the business anymore. We could really use someone with your expertise." All eyes turned to me. I could feel my face getting hot, but I managed to stay calm. "I've got my own career now," I said, keeping my voice steady. The thing about guilt trips is that they only work if you let them, and I was getting better at brushing them off. But that didn't stop my family from trying. One time, Dad even tried to play the practicality card. He called me up and started asking about my job. At first, I thought he was just making conversation, but it quickly turned into something else. "How much are they paying you over there?" he asked, like it was any of his business. "Enough," I replied, not giving him any details. "Well, we could really use someone with your skill set," he said. "I bet we could pay you just as much, if not more." I almost laughed. "Pay me more? With what money?" "Don't be like that," he said, clearly annoyed. "I'm serious. If you came back, we'd make it worth your while." It was tempting for about half a second, but I knew better. They'd been promising to make it worth my while for years, and it had never happened. The calls didn't stop there. Every few weeks, Dad or Mom would find a new reason to reach out. It was mostly about the business. "Do you have any tips for attracting more customers?" At one point, I started avoiding their calls altogether. It felt rude, but I needed the space. I couldn't keep putting myself in situations where I felt like the bad guy for living my own life. But even with all the distance I tried to create, the guilt still crept in. I'd lie awake some nights, wondering if I was being selfish. What if they really did need me? What if I was the one holding everything together, and my leaving had caused everything to fall apart? It wasn't until much later that I realized how manipulative they'd been. They didn't actually want me to succeed. They just wanted me to keep sacrificing for their bad decisions. But at the time, it was hard to see things clearly. Now, I realized that the guilt games were just their way of avoiding responsibility. It was easier to blame me for abandoning them than to admit they'd been running the business into the ground for years. But eventually, they wore me down. By the time I caved and decided to go back to the family business, I was 26. And honestly, I felt like I was walking into a storm I had no business being in. I'd spent years trying to establish my own life, my own career, but the guilt eventually broke me down. They didn't just want help. They made it sound like the whole business was about to crumble if I didn't step in. And maybe I was naive, but part of me thought I could actually fix things. Dad framed it like I'd be coming in to save the day. "We need fresh ideas," he said over the phone one night. "Someone who understands modern marketing, the way the world is changing." He talked a big game about how much they needed me, how much freedom I'd have, and how this was my chance to make a real impact. I figured, okay, maybe this is my shot. I'll come in, fix what I can, and then walk away once they're stable. From the moment I walked back into the restaurant, it was like stepping into a time capsule, and not in a good way. The place was outdated as hell. The decor hadn't been touched since the late 1990s. The menus were these crusty, laminated sheets with faded pictures, and the overall vibe screamed, "We're out of ideas." Even worse, there was no social media presence and no website worth mentioning. If you Googled the restaurant, the top result was a 1-star review complaining about cold food and bad service. And then there was my office. Dad had promised I'd be running the marketing department, but what he failed to mention was that the department was just me. My office was a desk shoved into a corner of the storage room, right next to the deep fryer oil. I literally had to move boxes of ketchup packets just to sit down. The staff situation was somehow even worse. Most of the employees were either family friends or people they'd hired on a whim. There was no structure, no training, and no accountability. One of the line cooks didn't even know how to make half the menu items. But instead of firing him, Dad kept saying, "We can't afford to lose anyone right now, and let's not forget Ryan." By the time I got there, he'd been given the title of operations manager, which was a joke. His idea of managing was showing up at noon, sitting in the office with his feet on the desk and scrolling through his phone. If anyone needed anything, he'd tell them to ask my dad or my cousin. Yeah, real leadership material. I rolled up my sleeves and tried to get to work. My first order of business was setting up a social media presence. I put together a campaign to promote the restaurant on Instagram and Facebook, with some basic strategies to boost engagement. When I pitched the idea to Dad, he immediately shut it down. "Social media? That's just a trend," he said. "We don't need to waste time on that." "It's not a trend, Dad," I said, trying to keep my cool. "Every restaurant has a social media presence these days. It's how people find new places to eat." "We've been doing fine without it," he said, waving me off. "We don't need to fix what isn't broken." Except it was broken. The business was losing money, foot traffic was down, and the reviews were brutal. But trying to convince Dad and Uncle Mike of that was like talking to a brick wall. Speaking of Uncle Mike, he was a whole other headache. He had this way of swooping in at the last minute and taking credit for anything that went well. One time, I spent weeks setting up a partnership with a local catering company to boost our revenue. I worked out all the details, designed a flyer, and even handled the negotiations. Right before the deal went through, Uncle Mike announced it to the staff as if it was his idea. He even gave himself a pat on the back during the next family meeting. "See, this is the kind of innovation we need," he said, grinning like he'd just solved world hunger. When I called him out on it later, he just shrugged. "We're all in this together," he said. "It doesn't matter who gets the credit." Of course, it mattered to him when he didn't get the credit. Ryan wasn't much better. One morning, I came in early to set up for a meeting with a potential new supplier. Ryan was supposed to handle the introductions, but he showed up 30 minutes late, coffee in hand, acting like it was no big deal. When I asked him what happened, he said, "I overslept. Chill out." That was Ryan's default response to everything: chill out. Meanwhile, I was running around trying to keep the business afloat while he got paid triple my salary for doing nothing. It wasn't just frustrating, it was exhausting. Every day felt like an uphill battle, and no matter how much effort I put in, nothing seemed to stick. If I came up with a promotion to attract new customers, Dad would veto it because we've never done that before. If I suggested updating the menu, Uncle Mike would complain that it was too expensive. And if I pointed out that Ryan wasn't pulling his weight, they'd all look at me like I was the problem. The final straw came about 6 months in. I'd been working on a complete rebranding strategy. New logo, updated menus, the whole 9 yards. I put together a presentation and scheduled a meeting with Dad, Uncle Mike, and Ryan to go over the details. Halfway through the meeting, Ryan interrupted me. "This all seems like a lot of work," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Can't we just do something easier, like a giveaway or something?" I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. "A giveaway?" I repeated. "That's your solution?" "Yeah," he said, shrugging. "People love free stuff." Before I could respond, Dad jumped in. "Ryan's got a point," he said. "We don't need to reinvent the wheel, let's keep it simple." That's when I realized nothing was ever going to change. No matter how much effort I put in, they'd always find a way to undermine it. They didn't actually want fresh ideas or innovation. They just wanted me to do all the work while they reaped the benefits. I stuck it out for a year, but by the end I was completely drained. The constant pushback, the lack of support, and the blatant favoritism were too much to handle. When I finally quit, Dad called me selfish. Uncle Mike said I was being dramatic, and Mom cried, of course. But honestly, I didn't care anymore. I tried my best and it wasn't enough. They didn't want to be saved. They just wanted someone else to take the blame for their failures. And I wasn't going to be that person anymore. But as much as I wanted to leave it all behind, life had other plans. For a while, life was good after I quit the family business. I threw myself into my work, moved into a better apartment, and even started traveling a bit. My family? Well, they didn't take my exit gracefully. Dad acted like I'd stabbed him in the back. Uncle Mike barely acknowledged me when we saw each other, and Mom, of course, cried every time we talked. But as much as they tried to guilt-trip me, I wasn't going back. Then 2020 happened. Like most people, I spent the first few months of the pandemic trying to figure out what the hell was going on. My company pivoted to focus on delivery and digital marketing, which kept me busy. But it also made me think about how unprepared the family business probably was. I knew their restaurants relied heavily on dine-in traffic, and I doubted they'd made any effort to adapt. Still, it wasn't my problem. They'd have to figure it out on their own, or so I thought. It was around mid-2021 when the calls started coming in. At first, it was just Dad, asking how I was doing and making awkward small talk. After a few minutes, he got to the real reason for the call. "We're struggling," he said, his voice heavy. "The pandemic hit us hard and we've had to close a couple of locations." I felt a pang of sympathy, but I kept my tone neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "We could really use your help," he continued. I wasn't surprised, but I still wasn't interested. "Dad, I have a full-time job," I said. "I can't just drop everything and come back." "It wouldn't be forever," he said, practically pleading. "Just long enough to get us back on track." I held my ground, but the calls kept coming. Mom called me next, and then Uncle Mike. They all had the same pitch. The business was in trouble, and I was the only one who could save it. At first, I resisted, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized they might not make it without help. As much as I resented them, I didn't want to see the business Grandpa built go under. Still, I wasn't about to walk back into the same mess I'd left behind. If they wanted my help, it had to be on my terms. I spent a week putting together a proposal. I'd take over operations and marketing, but I'd need a 40% ownership stake, full control over decisions, and a competitive salary. If they wanted me, they'd have to treat me like a professional, not a family obligation. When I presented my terms, the backlash was immediate. Dad accused me of taking advantage of the family in a time of crisis. Uncle Mike called it extortion. Even Mom, who usually stayed out of business matters, said, "I can't believe you'd put a price on helping your family." I stood my ground. "This isn't charity," I said. "You want my expertise? This is what it costs." It took them 2 weeks to come around. I'm guessing the mounting bills and angry calls from creditors had something to do with it. Eventually, they signed the agreement, though not without plenty of grumbling. Uncle Mike even tried to sneak in a clause limiting my authority, but I caught it and made him remove it. I was officially back in the fold. Walking into the restaurants again was surreal. Everything was worse than I'd imagined. Half the locations were shut down, the ones that were open were barely scraping by, and the staff morale was at an all-time low. My first order of business was introducing online ordering and delivery. It was something I'd been pushing for years, but Dad had always dismissed it as unnecessary. Now, it was the only way to survive. I set up partnerships with delivery platforms, revamped the website, and launched a social media campaign to let people know we were open for business. Within a few months, sales started to pick up. But not everyone was thrilled about the changes. Dad complained constantly about how impersonal online ordering felt. Uncle Mike griped about the fees from the delivery platform. And Ryan? Well, Ryan was just pissed that I'd fired him. Yeah, I fired Ryan. It was one of the first things I did after coming back. He strolled into the office one morning, an hour late as usual, holding a smoothie and acting like nothing had changed. "What's up, boss?" he said, smirking. "You're done," I said, handing him his termination letter. He looked at me like I'd just slapped him. "You can't fire me," he said. "Dad and Uncle Mike will back me up." "They signed off on this," I said, motioning to the letter. "Clear out your desk." To his credit, he didn't make a scene, but I could tell he thought I'd cave. He probably assumed he'd be back in a week or two once Dad and Uncle Mike started whining about family loyalty. But I didn't budge. Firing Ryan was just the beginning. I cut unnecessary expenses, renegotiated supplier contracts, overhauled the menu to focus on quality over quantity, and introduced a loyalty program to reward repeat customers. I even brought in a consultant to help train the staff, which Dad absolutely hated. "We've been doing this for decades," he said during one of our many arguments. "Why do we need some outsider telling us how to run things?" "Because what you've been doing isn't working," I said. "If you want to save this business, you need to let me do my job." The loyalty program was also a big hit, but it almost didn't happen. When I first pitched the idea, Uncle Mike rolled his eyes and said, "People don't care about points and discounts. They care about the food." "People care about both," I countered. "If we don't give them a reason to come back, they'll just go somewhere else." It took a lot of convincing, but eventually he agreed to let me try it. Within a few months, repeat business increased by 20%, and even Uncle Mike had to admit it was a good idea, not that he gave me credit for it. He just stopped complaining, which was as close to a compliment as I was going to get. Still, the tension with Dad and Uncle Mike never went away. No matter how much progress we made, they couldn't help but nitpick every decision I made. Dad accused me of being too focused on the numbers and not caring enough about tradition. Uncle Mike claimed I was taking too much credit for the turnaround, even though he'd contributed next to nothing. Even Mom got in on the act, asking me one night if I'd consider donating part of my salary back to the business. It would be a nice gesture, she said. You know, to show that you're really part of the family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything I'd done, they still wanted more from me. About a year ago, I finally quit. It wasn't a sudden decision. It had been building up for months. The business was in a good place financially, and I'd accomplished everything I set out to do. The restaurants were turning, a profit again, staff morale was up, and we had a loyal customer base. From the outside, everything looked great, but inside, it was a nightmare. The final straw came during one of our family meetings. By this point, I'd been running the operations and marketing for over 2 years. I'd modernized every aspect of the business, and it was thriving because of my efforts. But instead of being grateful, Dad and Uncle Mike were plotting behind my back. I found out they'd promised Ryan the CEO role. Yes, Ryan. Apparently, they decided that now that the business was stable, it was time to hand over the reins to family. Never mind that I was family too. In their minds, Ryan was the heir, and I was just the workhorse. When I confronted them, Dad didn't even try to deny it. You've done your part, he said. Now it's time for Ryan to step up and lead. Step up and lead? I repeated, trying not to lose it. He hasn't done anything except sit on his ass while I've been busting mine for the last 2 years. You don't understand, Uncle Mike said, as if I was the one being unreasonable. This business was always meant to stay in the family. Ryan has the right to be part of it. I am family, I said, my voice rising. But that's never mattered to you, has it? They looked at me like I was the problem. Like I was being selfish for not wanting to hand over everything I'd worked for to someone who didn't deserve it. That was the moment I knew I was done. The next day, I submitted my resignation and sold my ownership stake back to them at a significant profit. Dad tried to talk me out of it, offering to double my salary. Uncle Mike called me immature and said I was throwing away everything we'd built together. But I didn't care anymore. I'd given them everything I had, and it still wasn't enough. Now, a year later, I'm finally at peace with my decision. It wasn't easy at first. For the first few months, I kept waiting for the phone calls to start again, the guilt trips, the pleas for help. But they never came. I guess they thought if they ignored me, I'd come crawling back. As for the family business, it's not doing so great. From what I've heard, they've undone most of the changes I implemented. The loyalty program is gone, the menu is back to its bloated, outdated state, and their online presence is non-existent again. The worst part? They actually brought Ryan back. Apparently he's managing the business now, but based on the reviews I've seen, he's doing exactly what I expected, nothing. Customers are complaining about long wait times, rude staff, and inconsistent food quality. The restaurants are losing money again, and at least 3 locations have already closed. Do I feel bad about it? Not really. I gave them the tools to succeed, and they chose not to use them. That's on them, not me. At the end of the day, it's not my responsibility. I spent years trying to fix their mistakes, and it nearly broke me. Walking away was the best decision I ever made, and I've finally stopped feeling guilty about it. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that loyalty isn't about sacrificing yourself for people who don't appreciate you. True loyalty goes both ways. It's about mutual respect and support, not blind obligation. Now, when I look back at everything I went through, I don't feel bitter. I feel proud. Proud that I stood up for myself, proud that I set boundaries, and proud that I had the courage to walk away. Life's too short to waste on people who don't value you. If they can't see your worth, it's their loss, not yours. And that's where I'm at now. Finally at peace, finally free, and honestly, it feels pretty damn good.